This morning, a rare rebuke from Chief Justice John Roberts as President Trump escalates his fight with the judiciary, calling for the impeachment of the judge who tried to block the swift deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan migrants, a directive the judge says the Trump administration ignored. In a statement, Roberts saying for more than 2 centuries it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. Trump responding to the Chief Justice, saying Roberts never mentioned him by name, though it was clear Roberts was responding to the president's statement.
He didn't mention my name in the statement. I just saw it quickly. He didn't mention my name, but many people have called for his impeachment, the impeachment of this judge.
Trump is doubling down on his criticism of Judge James Boasberg, questioning his authority, saying if a president doesn't have the right to throw murderers and other criminals out of our country, then our country is in very big trouble and destined to...
Okay, so this is one of those stories that shows you just how far things have deteriorated when it comes to Trump and the rule of law in America, because we are now seeing something almost unprecedented in American history that should alarm every citizen, regardless of their political affiliation. The judicial branch of the United States government, Supreme Court justices and sitting federal judges and retired judges from across the entire political spectrum are closing ranks and speaking out publicly against what they see as Trump's systematic insults to the Constitution and to their fundamental role in enforcing it as an independent branch of government. This is absolutely not normal. Judges do not usually speak publicly about sitting presidents under any circumstances. They do not issue statements rebuking executive branch rhetoric, no matter how inflammatory. They stay above the political fray and let their rulings speak for themselves, because that is how judicial independence is supposed to work. But Trump's nonstop attacks on judges and his claims that his power is almost unlimited have triggered an unusually loud and what appears to be coordinated backlash that has the judiciary sounding a genuine alarm about the very survival of the rule of law in America. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
I want to ask you, when Donald Trump's team, when the government arrested a sitting judge and paraded her before the cameras, what were you thinking writ large about our justice system at that point?
Allie, as you suggested, but as the Chief Justice of the United States said publicly last week, the rule of law is endangered. On his first day in office in January, this president essentially declared war on the federal judiciary, the Constitution, and the rule of law. And for every day since then, until this day, the president himself, his vice president, his top White House aides, and his cabinet have been threatening the federal judiciary.
Let me walk you through what has been happening over the past year, because the accumulation of judicial pushback represents something genuinely extraordinary that every American needs to understand, regardless of how they feel about Trump or his policies. Chief Justice John Roberts, the head of the entire federal judiciary and someone who guards the Supreme Court's institutional reputation with almost obsessive care, issued a rare public statement earlier this year defending Judge James Boasberg after Trump and his Republican allies in Congress attacked the judge and openly floated impeaching him for ruling against parts of Trump's immigration agenda. Roberts took the extraordinary step of publicly contradicting the President of the United States and warning against treating judges as enemies of the people, language that echoes some of the darkest periods in American history when demagogues turned institutions against each other, undermined the foundations of democratic governance. Think carefully about what it means for the Chief Justice of the United States to issue that kind of public rebuke against a sitting president. Roberts is not a liberal activist judge looking for opportunities to criticize Trump for political reasons. He is a conservative appointed by George W. Bush, who has spent his entire career on the Supreme Court trying to keep the institution out of political controversies and maintain its legitimacy as a neutral arbiter of constitutional questions that Americans of all political persuasions can respect. For him to speak out publicly against a sitting president represents a calculation that staying silent would be worse for the institution he leads that Trump's attacks on the judiciary have become so dangerous and so damaging that the Chief Justice felt compelled to defend the courts, even at the significant cost of being dragged into a political fight he clearly did not want and would have preferred to avoid entirely. And Roberts is far from alone in sounding this alarm. Retired federal and state judges are now warning openly and on the record that the rule of law is unraveling under Trump's sustained assault on the courts and on the constitutional system of checks and balances. A Washington Post piece from just days ago, November 28, 2025, quoted retired judges describing a judiciary under extraordinary strain as Trump continues attacking any judge who rules against him, and as threats against judges and their families spike to genuinely alarming levels that have never been seen before in American history. These are people who spent their entire careers upholding the law and who now feel compelled to speak out publicly because they believe the very foundations of the constitutional system they dedicated their lives to serving are genuinely at risk of collapse. The threats against judges are not theoretical or exaggerated or partisan talking points. A Reuters investigation published earlier this year found that at least 11 federal judges and their families face direct threats or harassment after ruling against Trump's administration. In various cases across different areas of policy, judges have been swatted, meaning fake emergency calls were made to send armed police rushing to their homes in the middle of the night. They have received bomb threats at their homes and at their courthouses. Their family members, spouses, and children who had absolutely nothing to do with any of the cases have been targeted and harassed simply for being related to judges who ruled against Trump. And sitting judges have told reporters on the record that these threats almost always jump dramatically whenever Trump lashes out publicly at the judiciary, meaning there is a direct and undeniable connection between Trump's rhetoric and the physical danger judges face for simply doing their jobs. The situation has become so serious and so alarming that dozens of sitting federal judges, people who are supposed to stay completely silent about political matters under long-standing norms of judicial conduct, have broken their usual silence to criticize how the Supreme Court itself has handled Trump-related cases on its emergency docket. A New York Times survey of 65 federal judges found that 47 of them, nearly 3/4 of those surveyed, said the Supreme Court has mishandled these cases by issuing brief, opaque orders that let Trump's policies take effect while undercutting lower court judges who tried to block them through careful legal analysis. These judges warned explicitly that this approach feeds a judicial crisis that risks destroying public faith in the courts as neutral arbiters of constitutional questions rather than political actors pursuing partisan agendas. What you are seeing is something close to a coordinated alarm being sounded by the people who wear the robes throughout the American judicial system, from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court down to federal trial court judges to retired jurists who no longer have to worry about political consequences for speaking their minds freely. They are warning in increasingly urgent terms that Trump's attacks on the judiciary and his claims of almost unlimited presidential power represent a fundamental threat to the constitutional order they swore oaths to uphold and protect. All right. So let me walk you through in much more detail the specific incidents and statements that have brought the judiciary to this point of unprecedented public pushback against a sitting president of the United States. Because understanding the accumulation of attacks and threats and judiciary responses over the past year is absolutely essential for grasping why voices from across the entire judicial branch, conservatives and liberals and moderates alike, are now sounding alarms about the rule of law and constitutional democracy itself in America. The Chief Justice's statement in March 2025, defending Judge James Boasberg, was the most high-profile moment of judicial pushback against Trump, and it deserves close examination for what it revealed about how seriously the judiciary takes Trump's attacks on its legitimacy and independence. Boasberg is a federal judge who issued rulings blocking parts of Trump's mass deportation agenda, finding that certain aspects of the administration's approach violated legal requirements and constitutional protections that courts are obligated to enforce. This is exactly what federal judges are supposed to do under the constitutional system the founders established: review executive actions for compliance with the law and block those that exceed constitutional or statutory limits on presidential power. But Trump and his allies did not respond by simply appealing the rulings through normal legal channels and accepting adverse decisions as part of how the American system of government works. Instead, they launched a sustained and vicious personal attack on Boasberg himself, calling him partisan and biased and a rogue judge, and suggesting he was acting as an enemy of the administration rather than a neutral judge, applying the law as he understood it. Republican senators floated the possibility of impeaching Boasberg for his rulings, using the threat of removal from the bench to punish a judge for decisions they disagreed with on political rather than legal grounds. Chief Justice Roberts responded with a public statement that reporters and legal analysts described as standing up to Trump in an unusually direct and pointed way that the Chief Justice would normally never consider appropriate. Roberts defended Boasberg's integrity and the fundamental legitimacy of judicial review of executive action under the Constitution. He implicitly but clearly rebuked Trump's suggestion that courts cannot legitimately check presidential power and warned against the dangerous rhetoric that treats judges as enemies of the people simply for doing their constitutional duty to review executive action and ensure it complies with the law. For a Chief Justice who has spent his entire career trying to keep the Supreme Court above political battles and maintain its institutional legitimacy, issuing this kind of statement represented a very significant departure from his normal approach and a clear signal that Trump's attacks had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. Roberts calculated that staying silent would be worse than speaking out, that Trump's attacks posed such a serious threat to the judicial branch as an institution that the Chief Justice had to speak publicly, even at the substantial cost of being dragged into a political fight he clearly would have preferred to avoid entirely. The significance of Roberts speaking out in this way simply cannot be overstated for people who understand how the judiciary normally operates. Chief Justices almost never publicly criticize sitting presidents under any circumstances. They work extremely hard to maintain the appearance of complete judicial neutrality and to keep the court out of partisan conflicts that might undermine public confidence in its legitimacy. Roberts, in particular, has been absolutely obsessive about protecting the court's institutional reputation, often casting swing votes in major cases specifically to avoid the appearance that the court is simply another partisan political actor. For him to issue a public statement rebuking presidential rhetoric about the judiciary means he calculated that staying silent would cause more damage to the institution he leads than speaking out would, that Trump's attacks posed such a serious threat that the Chief Justice had to act. But Roberts was far from the only voice sounding alarms about what Trump is doing to the judiciary and to the constitutional system of checks and balances. Retired judges, who no longer face the same professional constraints on public speech that sitting judges do, have been increasingly explicit and urgent about their concerns. A Washington Post piece published on November 28, 2025, quoted multiple retired federal and state judges warning in stark terms that the rule of law is unraveling under Trump's sustained assault on the courts and on judicial independence. They described the judiciary under extraordinary strain from the combination of relentless political attacks from the president and his allies and physical threats against judges and their families that have escalated dramatically. They warned that the guardrails protecting American democracy may already be weakening in ways that could have lasting consequences well beyond Trump's presidency. These retired judges spoke with the authority and credibility of people who spent decades on the bench, upholding the law, and who understand intimately how the system is supposed to work and what it looks like when that system starts to break down. They are not partisan activists looking for opportunities to attack a president they disagree with politically. They are institutionalists who dedicated their entire careers to the judicial system and to the rule of law, and who now feel compelled to warn publicly that something fundamental is breaking in American constitutional democracy. When people with that background and that credibility say the rule of law is unraveling, that is a warning every American should take extremely seriously, regardless of their views on Trump or his policies. The threat dimension of this story is particularly alarming and connects directly to Trump's rhetoric in ways that have been documented by journalists who investigated the pattern. A Reuters investigation published in May 2025 documented that at least 11 federal judges and their families faced direct threats or targeted harassment after issuing rulings against the Trump administration in various legal cases. These were not vague online comments or general expressions of disagreement with judicial decisions. These were specific and credible threats and targeted harassment campaigns against judges and their spouses and their children for the offense of ruling against Trump in legal proceedings. The investigation found judges being swatted, a dangerous and potentially deadly practice where someone makes a fake emergency call, claiming violence or hostage situations at a target's home to trigger an armed police response that could easily result in someone being shot. Judges received bomb threats at their homes and at their courthouses. Family members who had absolutely nothing to do with any of the cases, including children, were harassed and threatened online and in person. The physical safety of federal judges, people who are supposed to be protected so they can rule impartially without fear of consequences, was being systematically compromised because Trump and his allies attacked them publicly for their rulings. Sitting judges told reporters that there is a clear and undeniable pattern connecting Trump's rhetoric to the threats they and their families receive. When Trump attacks a judge publicly, calling them partisan or biased or a rogue or suggesting they should be removed from the bench, the threats against that particular judge spike almost immediately and dramatically. Trump's millions of followers hear his attacks, and some percentage of them respond by threatening the judges he has targeted. The judges interviewed for these reports pleaded with political leaders across the spectrum to stop fanning the flames, to stop using rhetoric that puts targets on the backs of judges who are simply doing their jobs as the Constitution requires. A separate report, published in August 2025, quoted sitting judges describing the chilling effect of this threatening environment on judicial decision-making and on the willingness of qualified people to serve as judges. Judges are human beings with families who naturally worry about their physical safety and the safety of their loved ones. When ruling against a politically powerful president means potentially putting your family at risk of harassment or violence, that creates pressure on judicial decision-making that is absolutely not supposed to exist in an independent judiciary. Judges are supposed to rule based on the law without fear of personal consequences for themselves or their families. Trump's rhetoric and the threats it generates directly undermine that fundamental principle of judicial independence. Perhaps most remarkably, given how judges normally stay completely silent about political and institutional matters, dozens of sitting federal judges broke their usual silence to publicly criticize how the Supreme Court itself has handled Trump-related cases on its emergency docket. A New York Times survey of 65 federal judges found that 47 of them, nearly three-quarters, said the Supreme Court has mishandled these cases by issuing brief, unexplained orders that let Trump's policies take effect while undercutting lower court judges who tried to block them through careful legal analysis and reasoned opinions. Okay, so let us break down exactly what this unprecedented judicial pushback means and why the warnings from across the entire judicial branch, from the Chief Justice to sitting federal judges to retired jurists, represent such a significant and alarming moment in the ongoing conflict between Trump and the constitutional system he is supposed to operate within as president. Point number 1, Chief Justice John Roberts issuing a public statement defending a judge Trump attacked and implicitly rebuking presidential rhetoric about the judiciary is genuinely extraordinary and signals that Trump's attacks have reached a level of severity that the head of the federal judiciary felt he simply could not ignore without damaging the institution he leads. Roberts has spent his entire career keeping the court above political fights. For him to speak out publicly means he calculated that silence would be worse than the controversy of directly contradicting a sitting president. Point number 2, retired judges warning publicly and on the record that the rule of law is unraveling represents voices with decades of judicial experience and institutional credibility sounding an urgent alarm about the fundamental health of American constitutional democracy. These are not partisan activists seeking attention. They are institutionalists who dedicated entire careers to the legal system and who now feel compelled to warn that something essential is breaking in ways that may have lasting consequences. Point number 3, the documented and dramatic spike in threats against judges and their families whenever Trump attacks the judiciary shows a direct and undeniable connection between presidential rhetoric and physical danger to the people responsible for checking executive power. At least 11 federal judges and their families face specific threats or harassment after rulings against Trump, creating pressure on judicial independence that is fundamentally incompatible with how the system is supposed to work. Point number 4, sitting judges telling reporters on the record that threats almost always jump when Trump lashes out and pleading publicly with political leaders to stop fanning the flames represents an extraordinary cry for help from people who are supposed to stay completely silent about political matters under long-standing norms. The fact that sitting judges felt compelled to speak publicly shows how serious and dangerous the situation has become for those on the front lines of this conflict. Point number 5, the New York Times survey finding that 47 of 65 federal judges believe the Supreme Court has mishandled Trump cases on its emergency docket shows deep concern within the judiciary itself about how the highest court in the land is responding to the crisis Trump has created. Lower court judges feel undercut and abandoned and worry that the Supreme Court's approach is feeding rather than resolving the judicial crisis. Point number 6, Trump's rhetoric about having almost unlimited power over immigration and tariffs and other areas, and his attacks on judges who rule against him as partisan or rogue represent a fundamental rejection of the constitutional separation of powers that the founders carefully established. He is not treating judicial review as a legitimate check on executive authority. He is treating it as an illegitimate obstacle to be overcome through intimidation and delegitimization campaigns. Point number 7, the impeachment threats against Judge Boasberg from Republican senators for ruling against Trump's immigration policies represent a dangerous attempt to weaponize congressional power against judicial independence. If judges can be threatened with removal simply for issuing rulings the executive branch disagrees with politically, the entire system of constitutional checks and balances collapses because judges will be afraid to rule against presidents. Point number 8, the physical security dimension of this crisis connects to broader questions about whether the government is doing enough to protect judges who face escalating threats for doing their jobs. Congressional fights over security funding for judges and their families have become more urgent as the threats increase. But the fundamental problem is the presidential rhetoric that generates the threats in the first place. Point number 9, What judges across the entire spectrum are warning is that if Trump succeeds in delegitimizing the judiciary as a check on executive power, the damage to American democracy may be lasting and may outlive his presidency by decades. Once public faith in courts as neutral arbiters of constitutional questions is destroyed, it is extremely difficult to rebuild, and the consequences affect far more than just Trump-related cases. So where does all of this leave the relationship between Trump and the judicial branch that is supposed to check his power and enforce constitutional limits on what any president can do? We have the Chief Justice publicly rebuking presidential rhetoric, something that almost never happens under any circumstances. We have retired judges warning openly that the rule of law is unraveling. We have sitting judges describing threats that spike dramatically whenever Trump attacks them. We have nearly 3/4 of surveyed federal judges criticizing how the Supreme Court is handling the crisis. And we have a president who continues attacking any judge who rules against him and claiming powers that courts have said exceed constitutional limits. The judiciary is sounding an alarm that should concern every American, regardless of their political affiliation or their views on Trump's policies. These are not Democratic activists or partisan opponents looking for ways to attack a president they disagree with politically. These are judges appointed by presidents of both parties who have dedicated entire careers to upholding the law and who now believe the constitutional system they serve is under genuine threat of lasting damage. When the Chief Justice of the United States feels compelled to publicly defend judges against presidential attacks, something has gone seriously wrong with how American government is supposed to function. The framers of the Constitution created an independent judiciary specifically to check executive power and enforce constitutional limits on what presidents can do. They understood from history that concentrated power in one branch without effective checks inevitably leads to tyranny and the destruction of liberty. The entire system depends on the executive accepting judicial authority as legitimate, not attacking judges personally whenever they rule against the president. What we are witnessing is a sustained assault on that foundational principle, and judges from across the entire system are warning that the damage may already be severe enough to threaten the rule of law itself in America. Trump can dismiss these warnings as partisan attacks or institutional bias all he wants, but the voices speaking out include conservative judges appointed by Republican presidents and the Chief Justice himself, who was appointed by George W. Bush. This is not a left-right partisan issue. It is an issue about whether constitutional democracy can survive a president who treats judicial review as an illegitimate obstacle rather than a fundamental check on executive power established by the founders. That is the story of Supreme Court justices and judges across the entire federal system uniting against Trump's attacks on the Constitution and the judiciary, and why their warnings about the rule of law unraveling should alarm every American who cares about the survival of the constitutional system the founders created and that generations of Americans have sacrificed to preserve. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about all of this. Do the warnings from judges across the spectrum change how you view Trump's attacks on the courts? Should the Chief Justice be speaking out even more forcefully? And what happens to American democracy if the judiciary loses its legitimacy as a check on presidential power? Hit subscribe because this story is ongoing and developing, and there will be much more to cover as the conflict between Trump and the courts continues to escalate and judges keep warning about the threat to the rule of law in America. See you in the next one.